I'm on? Okay. What's up, big guy?
About it, baby.
All right, we'll give it just a little bit longer and we'll get started. Yeah. Wait on Blake to get here. All right, I think we got critical mass, and I'm excited about this class. We've been working on it for a month or two now, trying to get there. And I told Aaron this morning we're either going to end really short or we're going to go over really, really far. So there's a lot to unpack here. Welcome live stream. Excited you guys are with us. Heads up, we're going to be doing a lot of page flipping and getting into the Word. Gary did a phenomenal job last week recapping and opening up this book. But more importantly, just recreating for you in, I think he did it in less than 25 minutes, the entire story of the Old Testament and why all of that leads up to this moment. And this moment ends up being disappointing. But it is exactly what the Jews and the people of God had been waiting for the entire time. So kudos to Gary for doing that. I've watched several people try to do it in preparation for this, and he did a phenomenal job. So we are going to recap, and we're going to touch on that. But I just want you guys to give me some grace because Gary covered 5 verses, and that took him the entire class, and I've got to cover 6 chapters in the same amount of time. And there's just as many things to connect to, so hopefully we'll connect some dots that are meaningful for you, and we'll get through the class together. This is going to be a little bit more academic than I normally like to do, but I am excited because if you can stay with us each class, and if you miss one, watch it online, everything that we'll be teaching is going to build up to a few weeks of preaching. And as you both know, Gary and I like to talk and we like to yell, so the preaching side of it is what we're excited to get to, but we want to lay the foundational work these next couple weeks for why this means so much, so that when we start to try to apply it to our lives, it means a little bit more and it hits a little bit harder. So really, if you didn't get to watch Gary's lesson, go back. I think we can put it, the live stream, we can put a link to it. But you'll have this one, and each one will build up, and then we'll have a couple weeks of preaching on this actual passage. So before we get into it, though, I think we got everybody here. Kristen's here, so I can now pray, make sure everybody's covered. She was serving. So let's pray. God, we know who you are. And I pray that we can rest in that because you're a God who has a plan, and it's a perfect plan. And even though we fall, even though we doubt it, even though we get lazy, even though we get bored, God, you are faithful. And so just like the Jews and your people back then, God, we miss the mark, and we forget, and we take our eyes off of you. So God, I just pray as you open up these scriptures to us, that you open up our hearts. God, the smallest fact can change who we are because of what you've done. God, the smallest detail can move men and nations and communities, and because you are amazing. And so in this, I just pray that we look for where you showed up. We look for where you were amazing, God, and we see that we need this relationship with you so desperately because you're steadfast and you are consistent. And we're the ones who keep going up and down, year after year, decade after decade, God, and you stay the same. And so I just pray that as we open up Ezra and Nehemiah, that we can see that, God, you are a God who made a covenant with us, and you're going to fulfill that covenant. And so, God, we just want to participate with you in that. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. All right. So we call this the Cornerstone Construct, and the reason why we did that is because basically we're breaking down a point in the Bible where the Jews would have been ready to be restored. They would have been ready for the Jeremiah promise and covenant that he prophesied about, for that to actually happen to them in that day at that time. And so these people would have known that. Jeremiah, Isaiah, the Psalms, those were the scriptures that they were hearing regularly. Those were the ones that they knew. Those were the ones that they were talking about. And all those pointed back to a point when Israel was restored and all nations received the promise of God. And so they believed that that was going to happen through them. And what we learn, later in the New Testament is that the cornerstone was missing. And so you can't build a wall without the cornerstone because it won't last, right? And Jesus is the cornerstone. And so in this moment, they're doing everything that God's asked them to do. They're doing a lot of what God's moved them to do, but then they're human. And so trying to figure out, how do we rebuild? How do we do what God has asked us to do in the midst of all the things that are going on around us, right? Every story in the Bible is just a moment in time, and there's years between this. In Ezra and Nehemiah, sometimes there's 70 years between verses. But we read it as just this story of a bunch of guys who tried to rebuild some walls, but literally we're talking about decades of faithfulness, right? Think about your life. I'm going to hit 4 decades in June, and the ups and downs that I've had are ridiculous, and the lack of faith that I've had is ridiculous, but the monumental moments in which God has showed up are just as ridiculous. And so this mindset that you have to have is not just what does it mean in this moment to you and even to these people in those moments, but this span of time is significant. So not only has there been a long waiting period, but like in the middle of this, there's chunks of time where it's not going like they thought it would. And so for us, as people who have hope and have the cornerstone, we know that like Jesus is the essential piece that gives us that foundation, that security, and that hope. But don't miss it. These guys were still looking for a Messiah. These guys were still looking for that same hope, right? They were assuming that the people would return, and we're waiting on God to return. And so we're in Ezra and Nehemiah. It was originally written as one book, and the story is probably one of the coolest literary things that I've ever broken down. And that's not a high bar because I've only probably broken down most of my English assignments from high school and college and maybe a couple other books. But as you start to look at what this story was doing and how it was written, one of the things that I want you to know is the Bible is a testament to itself. People try to talk about how it's not real or that it contradicts itself or whatever. No other book, no other group of scrolls, scriptures, writings has taken as much scrutiny as the Bible and held up. So even in this moment where we're going to look at, kind of this chronological order of some things that happened, and it's going to seem like a story's being built. This is actually being told after all this has happened. So there was whoever the author was is clearly trying to show you 3 points of the story, 3 points in time, but also showing you how all of it came together and the patterns that start to make up and reflect back to the Exodus and eventually back to the Messiah. And the way that that's done just from a literary perspective is absolutely amazing. And so I want you to know that the Bible is a testament unto itself. Like, it holds up. It doesn't need you. It doesn't need you to defend it. It's got its own chops, and it does some amazing things. And this book will just unlock a couple, but I want to show you how intelligent that these guys were, because I think a lot of times we look back and we see these people of the past and we're like, oh, those are the dumb people from the Old Testament. They couldn't get it right. That's not really fair, because we didn't get it right yesterday, right? But these authors also were literally ahead of their time on how they were able to construct and build things, and so want to call that out. There we go. So Gary broke down the covenant and basically the Jeremiah expectation. So Jeremiah comes out and talks about that you're going to be, I'm your God, and you're going to be my people, and then I'm going to write it on your hearts, and that this idea of a restoration and a rule is coming. Ultimately, the idea of a Messiah and King. And so when they find out that all these, in each one of these sections, when they find out that they're going to rebuild or they're going to return, they're excited because they think they're a part of something bigger that they've been told about. And in some cases, they've only heard whispers of for a long time, because a lot of them hadn't necessarily been in the Word, or this hadn't been practiced around them. So to them, it almost didn't seem like it was real, and then all of a sudden, boom, it's happening. And so Gary did a good job of unpacking that. So I'm going to focus on 1 through 6. The cliff notes of it is they go back, they rebuild the altar of the Lord. There's some opposition, and then they come back and they rebuild the temple foundation. And then there's going to be a restoration, and then as Gary deemed it, and so I used it, there's going to be a what the crap moment. And so that's what I'm going to walk you through. But I want you to know that, like, this pattern is kind of goes throughout, and you'll start to see why that's important. Where am I pointing? This way? There we go. Okay. So this is the literary thing that I was telling you about. So this story is it's a symmetrical story, 1 through 6, and it's leading and portraying the expectations and plight of God's people. So what's going to happen is, in the first chapter, you're going to have an edict, and that's going to come from Cyrus, and he's basically going to say, you guys go back, restore the temple. Here's a bunch of stuff that we stole from you guys. You can have it back. We believe that there should be a God on the other side of the river. You guys have my support. Go do it. And so and then there's going to be this giant list of people, and those are all the people who are returning. Then we're going to go and we're going to rebuild the altar and the temple and the foundations. And then all of a sudden, that's going to be kind of threatened, or there's going to be some opposition. And so that starts to kind of work itself out. There's a little bit more opposition, and then the rebuilding kind of stops, and then the rebuilding resumes. And then the list of all the people and the returnees is to say, basically, like, this happened and this is who was there. And Cyrus makes an edict for them to finish doing what they had started to do, and they finish with the Passover. And so the fact that this actually starts out in Hebrew and then is reflected in Aramaic is also pretty interesting, because if you think about how the Bible was written in the different languages, this symmetry, I don't know if it would have been noticed necessarily by the common person, but it definitely would have been noticed by, say, the Levites and those who were studying the scriptures, because this is a pattern also that points back to the Exodus. Everything in this book is basically lending credibility to who God is, who they are as people, credibility to what they were doing and why they did it, and more importantly, that they are the new Exodus, the new exiles returning to restore God's kingdom. And so that credibility is a big deal. And so the sophistication of how this was written is actually a big deal, and points to the fact that these Hebrew writers are showing the stories and patterns that happen throughout the Old Testament. You can actually start to go back and look at this particular pattern, and you can see those stories in multiple places, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, chapter 1 is the rebuilding and the new Exodus. And so, what I want to do here is go, there we go. First thing I want to remind you guys of is that covenants are a big deal. And so this is the recap of kind of what Gary talked about. Everything up to this point, the prophets and the teachers, is that God has a covenant with his people. And God is basically, time after time, he's claimed us. And he's claimed the Jews. And so in Exodus 6, he says, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And that happened in Exodus 6. And then later in Leviticus, he says, I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. And then later in Jeremiah, like we talked about and Gary alluded to, he says, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make with them the everlasting covenant, which is a big deal, right? That's a covenant that lasts forever. I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, and they may not turn from me. And so imagine a people who, from their existence, their entire identity is that God chose them. Can you imagine that? Can you relate to that? Like, is your identity, imagine that God's saying this about you, right? God's saying these things about you, because at the end of the day, he really is telling you that you are my people. And he's been telling you that from the beginning of your existence. From the garden, he's been reminding you that he wants to walk among you, and he wants to restore this relationship with you. So that's why this is so important. And so then the Edict of Cyrus comes in. Cyrus comes in, however you want to say it. And I kind of highlight, if you've been in one of my classes, I like to highlight things in bold so I remember to talk about them, but more importantly, you see the things that I think are popping out of the scripture. So let's see. Aaron, can you read 1 through 4? It'll be up on the screen if you guys want to watch it live stream. But the things I want you to pay attention to is where God or God's house or God helping kind of is called out, just in the first 4 verses there.
In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm, and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem.
Okay, so Gary talked about the significance of this. I want to talk about some of the hyperlinks in this and why this is this is relevant to the people believing that they were literally reenacting the story of Exodus. So one, it's the fact that God has charged them to go somewhere for where he's going to reside, right? So when he comes out, he says, hey, I'm going to take you to the promised land. I'm going to reside there. You're going to be my people. And then he says to them, and this is what's interesting, is that his heart was moved by God to do this, or his spirit was stirred to do this. And so if you think about Pharaoh was also moved in different ways to get God's people where they needed to go. But this last little line here, it says, silver and gold with goods and the beast silver and gold with goods and with beast, besides freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So when they actually left, this is actually a callback to when they were actually leaving Egypt. And so we'll break down that a little bit further. But as you go on, Aaron, if you'll keep reading 5 through 8.
Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus king of Persia brought these out in the charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed it. Are we repeating ourselves now? Cyrus king of Persia brought these out in the charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah.
Okay, so I didn't tell her to say that, but that's the point of these two verses, is that God, and in this edict, so basically you have a leader who put them in exile, who's coming in and saying, okay, you are now free people, you're now a free people, so there's authority on earth given by the authority of God to free his people. And then 3 different times he basically says, I'm going to give you silver, gold, and the things that you need to bless my name. Right, because they used to use the animals and the beasts to sacrifice offerings. And so in this moment, 3 times, right, we know the Bible, when the Bible does something 3 times, that's significant. In this edict, God's basically reminding the people, and I love this, this actually gets me a little choked up. He's like, I know the king's saying it, but you hear me? Do you hear what I'm telling you right now? I'm giving this to you. They would have known that, right? They would have known that, hey, when they left, this happened, because in Exodus, you're struggling here. There we go. So in Exodus 12, it's literally this verse, and this is why it's there 3 times. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people in the favor of the sight of the Egyptians, so that, and this is what I like, so that they let them have what they had asked. Thus, they plundered the Egyptians. So in this moment, God's reminding them, remember when I took all the Egyptian stuff and I made it right? Remember when I made you free people and I gave you what you needed to be able to rebuild my house? So God's saying that no matter what you went through, I'm supplying everything that you need. And then in this way, he says, thus they plundered the Egyptians. So even in that, God's saying, I fought for you, I got you out of here, but also this kind of revenge, this idea that we plundered them, I did that. I made them willingly do that. So he's acknowledging that he is going before them, and they don't have to take care of all this, right? They literally just have to follow God because he's supplying their every need. And so I think that's pretty interesting, because later on in Nehemiah, you're going to hear this said a couple times, that God will fight for us. So right there, even in the edict, God is calling out and reminding the people who are reading this that I'm showing up in all of this. 2 things to call out this guy, Mithredath and then Sheshbazzar. They're both significant, and they're going to pop up in this story. The first one is likely just the name given to the treasurer, so he may not actually be a character. It could have been, this is the person appointed to be the treasurer. But Sheshbazzar is interesting here because his name actually means, may blank protect the father. And so typically it's assumed that this is probably some type of reference to the moon god, Zin or Sin in that day. But there's a lot of discussion on his relationship to Zerubbabel. But what we do know is that these are 2 men who've been appointed and given authority by Cyrus to be able to have authority over the people and to take care of the needs and to kind of carry out these wishes. So I'm going to figure it out one time. That way it works. Okay. So one of the things I want to call out here is that the idea that God is moving, right? And you'll see this a couple times throughout Scripture, so I'll make these references. You're familiar with this one. We talked about it. Pharaoh's heart was hardened, right? So this king, who's literally, at this point in time, is in charge of the majority of the world. Like, he's got one of the largest kingdom, if not the largest kingdom in the world, and God is moving him to move his people. And so in this scenario, Egypt was pretty powerful back in the Exodus. They have God's people, and God hardens his heart, and then eventually he opens him up to be able to free the people. And then God also hardened the heart of the Egyptians and basically ticked them off so that they would actually go into this water that had just parted and attack after the people. So again, we're talking about the idea that God is literally taking the hearts and minds of men and moving them in certain directions for the sake of his people. And then another time, Nebuchadnezzar, you guys probably know the story with the Babylonian king, like he actually eventually acknowledged who God was. And so you'll see here in Daniel 5 that he actually talks about his heart being hardened. But at one point, like, he knew who God was. He had had an experience with God. He got a little full of himself, and God basically turns him into something like a donkey, and he's eating grass. So to remind him that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And so one of the things you're going to see here, both in the scriptures and then with the theme of God, is that God is putting people in charge to make things happen. And so there's issues. As soon as that's in question, you start to see opposition and you start to see a lack of progress and struggle. And so one of the things I think that throughout this story you have to remember is that they're trying to assert themselves as a nation. And so their authority is a big deal, but they're also asserting themselves as a nation inside the realm of this king and this empire and trying to figure out how to work. So anytime there's a power gap or a power struggle, it creates a giant distraction for the people of God. I don't know if you guys get caught up in political stuff, but apparently they did. So one of the things that I want to remind you is that this is a very powerful part. It says, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus the king. And so even there, and then like he reminded him in Daniel 5, like God appointed these people to be in charge and that he's got a plan. Okay, so the takeaway from basically chapter 1. All right, y'all got that? I just want y'all to know I'm pressing the button 5 times before it's, okay. That's going to be really frustrating here in a minute, but we'll get through it. All right, so we kind of hit this. So the takeaways from chapter 1 here is that everyone whose spirit God has stirred up. And so even in this idea of them coming back, like God is stirring the leaders, he's stirring the people, and then like the people, the actual Jews, some of them didn't come back. So like God stirred and said, hey, here's some stuff going on, like how are you going to respond to it? And there's still a covenant nature that requires an individual response. And so while God is dictating what an entire people are doing, it seems like that there's people who were on board with it and who weren't, who were chosen to be in his people. So one of the things that's interesting there is the word ruach is used as spirit, and in this context, it refers kind of to the human person, but it's the idea of this volitional process, right? And that seems like a big word, so I looked it up. It's the faculty or power of using one's will. And so God is stirring up the spirit in you for you to do your will, which is aligned to his will. And so in this moment, you have a choice, and the people had the choice, and the king still seems like he had some choice in the matter to go with this stirring and to go with this spirit. But at the end of the day, for the people and for the leaders like Zerubbabel, there's still a covenant response that I'm going to follow my God because I am and I want to be his people and be a part of his plan. And then the other thing that's called out a lot that I think is interesting, it's hinted there in the encourage them, but where I want to go is the free will offering. So that is the free will offering is something that could be given regularly. It was a peace offering. It was probably one of the more frequent ones, but basically it was an offering that made you right with God. It was a way to kind of acknowledge who God was and who you were and the state that you were in. And even in that, these people who, a lot of them had nothing, God gave them all of the gold and silver and the beast and the means to be able to just get right with God. And I say it that way because it wasn't like there's a whole deal about sin offerings and there's a reason why these other offerings were happening, but like he's reminding them of who he is and who they are. And they can do that pretty frequently. And you'll start to see that happen in chapter 3 when we start to rebuild the altar. But imagine the idea, and it says this in 2 Peter. He's basically telling them, I'm giving you everything you need to live a godly life. Like, I'm giving you a place to go, and I'm giving you everything you need so that we can have a relationship. And so that idea of the free will offering is a callback to Exodus. And it's something that I think is pretty important, and it would have reminded the people of the idea of a new Exodus. So we have chapter 2, we're not going to read it, is a giant list of people who came back. And honestly, the numbers aren't super impressive. It would barely make a big city in the U.S. But the main thing you need to know is that establishing a lineage, establishing credibility, and establishing who was there and who came back was important because this is literally the start of the new civilization, right? This is the founders. This is the people who came back. So when you say, my father's father's father, this is going to be documented. And so the idea that there's a lineage, there's an idea that there's a seed, reestablishing that into a new community, into a new political environment is extremely important. And so it's very significant, but it's going to be really hard to read all the names and would take a really long time. So we'll hop right into chapter 3. Okay. Aaron, can you read that? You want to hold it a little lower. There you go. That's really loud.
And they kept the feast of booths, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offerings by number, according to the rule, as each day required. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon, and all the appointed feast of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who made a freewill offering to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid.
Okay, so basically they've come back, the Levites and Zerubbabel and Jeshua. They're starting to establish like who the different responsibilities go to and like who's in charge of what. But the first thing that they come back and do, and the first thing that they are commanded to, is to build the altar of the God. And what that does, though, is while the temple was a big deal, the whole idea of the altar ensured the presence of God and ensured the communication of God with his people. So the fact that they went and built this back up and then were able to do this is pretty interesting. But if somebody wants to turn to, I'll do it for a second time. I was going to say Exodus 27. There's a... Somebody else is going to have to do it. My computer's messing up. Just start with 1 through 8.
You are to construct the altar of acacia wood. The altar must be square, 7.5 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. It must be 4.5 feet high. Make horns for it on its 4 corners. The horns are to be made of one piece. Overlay it with bronze. Make its pots for removing ashes, and its shovels, basins, meat forks, and fire pans. Make all the utensils of bronze. Construct a grate for it of bronze mesh, and make 4 bronze rings on the mesh of its 4 corners. Set it below, under the altar's ledge, so that the mesh comes halfway up the altar. Then make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with bronze. The poles are to be inserted into the ring so that the poles on the two sides of the altar when it is carried. Construct the altar with boards so that it's hollow. They are to make it just as it was shown to you on the mountain.
So this was a big deal, and this was a big process early on. And so when the Babylonians came in, they actually removed this altar. And when they took it, though, they took all the bronze off. So this kind of took the shiny and the kind of pretty parts of this off. And now just the inner stone and the altar kind of remain. So they're bringing back a stripped-down version of the altar, but they still see it so important because they want to reestablish these rituals as soon as possible so that they have the ability to interact with their God. The other piece here that's really interesting is that it calls out, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. The man of God is probably the most ultimate compliment you can get. It's from the word Elohim, and it's used 76 times to refer to Yahweh's faithful servant. The group of men it was used for was Elisha, Elijah, Samuel, David, Shammai, and Hanan, and there's another 29 times where it's talked about. But this is interesting because really it establishes the credibility. Because even if you were, not great on all your history and education, you knew who Moses was. And so the fact that you're announcing that this happened is just a quick way to establish why you're doing what you're doing and the credibility as to why you're doing it. The people of the lands comes up, and there's a couple different references to that. It's people who owned land. It could be the opposition or the people who didn't go to Babylon, who were Jews who stayed and came around. But ultimately, there's people in the land who aren't super excited that the Jews are there. But the other phrase that I like, and the reason why I put it in red, is because in the creation story, it says at the end of every day that there was morning and there was evening that day. And so whenever we establish God's presence, then the burnt offerings are there every morning and every evening. And so it's basically reminding you that the relationship of God is back, and he's here in the morning and he's here in the evening. Light and dark are rebuilt as the altar was rebuilt. All right, next part of chapter 3 is some of the good stuff. And they kept the Feast of Booths, and then they went after and they started doing the daily offerings that were required each day. A lot of the burnt offerings were happening. They did the new moon, and they appointed different feasts. And so what's really happening here is the calendar is being restored. So this idea of regularity and rhythms is starting to happen. So they rebuilt the altar, they rebuilt this calendar, and now you're starting to see a daily and a repetitive interaction with who God is and what he wants to do with his people. So it's just starting, and it's starting to feel like it used to. It's starting to feel like what they had heard. And at this time, Haggai was talking about this, but what's interesting here is that at this point, the temple hadn't actually been built. So just the altar, maybe some foundational stuff on the temple, that's debated. But there was a delay, and we'll hear kind of why that happened. But Haggai calls this out. They build the altars, and they're excited about it. Can you imagine somebody being like really excited about something that happened spiritually and then focusing on that and then just kind of dying off after just a few years or a few weeks or days, right? That's a pattern that we do regularly. And so Haggai calls them out. He's the prophet during this time, and he says, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruin?" Talking about God's house. "Now, therefore, thus says the Lord, consider your ways." And so God's like, wait, you guys, I show up, you guys get all excited about it, that we're back together, and then you get in your houses, you start living your life, and you forget about me. And Haggai's like, no, that's not going to work, guys. And so he says again, because of the house that lies in ruins, which while each of you busies himself with his own house, therefore the heavens above will withhold dew. And he basically says you're going to struggle because you forgot about me again. And so they bring God back, they surround him, they get excited, they get into their regular rhythms, the good rhythms, and then they forget about who God is. And so this repetitive pattern is something that we go through. So Haggai gets on them. Zerubbabel gets on them. And in chapter 3, we find out that they are renewed and that they want to be able to actually build the temple again. And so they get on it and they get to work. So they build the foundations for the temple. And then you'll notice here that it talks about the trumpets. That's announcing God's presence and God's people. And you notice the cymbals, which is a ushering in of God's Spirit to praise the Lord according to the direction of King David. Again, this is calling out. This is intentional. David was the king worshiper. We're about to worship. We're establishing our credibility. We're establishing our history. We're establishing who we are. And then they go into this phenomenal praise and worship where it's responsive. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And so then they celebrate and they worship. And so when the foundations are laid, what should we do? We should worship. And we should worship together. All right, so here's some takeaways, and I'll leave this behind for later, but this is kind of chapter 3. We rebuilt the altar. Forgiveness and gratefulness are starting to happen on a daily basis. They rebuild the calendar because that's significant politically, spiritually, and just in general. Having patterns for people who are trying to follow God is a good thing. They rebuild the temple. Together they worship. Together they build, and they root themselves in who God is and where he is. So there's some questions that you can ask yourself. When do we gather? Why do we gather? What does our church start to look like? Why is it important to know these things? Mackey actually says something that I love. He says, the moment these scriptures get boring to us, we need to be worried. And so you think about it, these rhythms and these patterns got boring quick, and they lost their way, and so they had to struggle again. So they had famine, they had a lack of water, and God said, look, I got to remind you that you need me. And they fell pretty quickly. So again, you'll see here in Isaiah 40, I'm not going to go through all of these, but Isaiah 40, Ezra 1:11, Exodus 33, Ezra 2:68, all of this mirrors the idea of the new covenant, the old covenant that God had with the Israelites as they came out of Egypt. And you'll see here later in chapter 6, they're actually celebrating it with the Passover. So this idea of their identity was they were the returning people. And so our identity, though, is a little bit different because we know that Jesus came. Our identity is in the idea that the return of God himself. So God came back and he's doing these things. So does your life actually mirror the reenactment of the Jews leaving Egypt? Does it reenact these guys coming back? Because God's people were free, but before that they were enslaved. And do you have the gratefulness that comes with that? Do your patterns produce the essence of who God is? Is your life an aroma like these offerings were to remind you of who you are and where you stand with God? And if you think about this, even to the point that we do communion and we celebrate the Passover and we celebrate God coming back, he says, remember me. And so they were doing exactly what we're doing, right? We study the Bible, we set up the altar, we have a time to come together, we have a calendar, we do this regularly so that we can continue to move with God. All right. I told you guys we were going to go over, so I'm going to skip some parts here. All right. So one of the things I think is interesting is that we need to remember that when they built this foundation together, they weren't doing something new. They were doing what God had said from the beginning. And so we don't need to reinvent. Maybe we need to reinvigorate. Maybe we need to reinstitute. Maybe we need to return to the source. But at the end of the day, that's why they rebuilt this, to rebuild their identity. They went back to the ancient ways, and you hear that in the Old Testament. So a lot of times we think that we're going to come up with something new, and really we just need to return to the source. But one of the things that we got to remember is that there's going to be opposition, that there's going to be threats, that these people are going to come, and you'll start to see that here in chapter 4. But more importantly, we have to finish what we start. We have to worship who he is, and we have to remember that it's his steadfast love that gives us hope for the future. All right, so we're not going to read chapter 4, but I want to get through kind of what's happening in chapter 4 and unfold this for you. So basically, you can check this in 2 Kings, there were some people in this land who hung around. There were some Jews that hung around, and basically they get together. Some bad things are happening. and like this land has basically been abandoned. And God sends these lions because basically he's not getting worshiped or praised. And so the people of the land were like, hey, these lions came and they're ruining everybody's life. Let's figure out what's missing. They figure out that it's the God of the Jews that's not being taken care of. And the reason why I say it like that is because they still worship their other gods. But he comes back and he says, hey, they come back and so they start adding God to that, adding the Jewish God to that so that their lives will get better. These people would have been remaining in the land, and so they come up to Zerubbabel and they're like, hey guys, can we build this with you? Like, we acknowledge who your God is and we appreciate who he is. Like, can we do this with you? And Zerubbabel's basically kind of rude about it, and he's like, no, like, we're different than you. We're nothing like you. The king told us to do that, and we're following orders. And so one of the things that's interesting, though, is Haggai and Zechariah at this time actually talk about the opportunity to reach other nations and for God's promise to start to expand. And so it's interesting that God brings in these strangers or neighbors, and Zerubbabel kind of gives them the cold shoulder. And then you'll see as the story unveils is that they actually end up being the enemies. So in Zechariah 2:10, when he starts to talk about the idea that we could actually expand this thing, that this could start to grow, and this could be where like all nations start to acknowledge who God is, Zerubbabel's actions, whether right or wrong, created a friction that now these guys are basically poised as the enemies for the next two guys, and they start to write letters, and they start to complain, and they start to put up opposition. And so one of the things that I think is interesting here is that, you know, how we deal with neighbors when we're doing God's work is very important. We need to be very considerate of what we're doing and who we're doing it with. Man, I'm at halfway through. All right, so I've already told you guys this. Again, so this is where halfway through the story, you start to see that you've got the opposition, so then there's going to be some rebuilding that actually happens. And so basically there's, see how I want to end this. So basically the Zerubbabel kind of ticks off these people. There's a riff and a rejection, and they write a letter to the king. And mind you, this is actually over several years. They write a letter to the king, and the king goes back, checks the record, finds them to be a threat. They lied about who the Jews were and how dangerous they were. So the king's like, shut it all down. And so basically they're crushed. They're like, wait, we don't get to rebuild this thing like we wanted to? And the king says, absolutely not. So they basically have to wait 70 years to get started again. In the meantime, Haggai and Zechariah remind them, hey, you need to rebuild the temple. It's not about how big the temple is going to be. It's the fact that God's going to be there. And then all of a sudden they start rebuilding. Zechariah does the same thing. And sorry, guys. I told y'all there was too much in here. All right, we'll start here. So Zechariah comes in and he basically tells them, like, get to building. And this guy writes the letter and he says, hey, look, you know, you need to be worried about these people. Basically check the records again. And so in 5, Tattaniah writes this letter and says, hey, are y'all sure they're supposed to be doing this? He goes back, checks the logs, and the king comes back and says, you know what, they are. And on top of that, let's figure out how do we help them do it faster and better. I'm not going to get to that. They celebrate Passover. All right, Gary, I'm going to stop there because I can't get all the way to there. So here's what I'm going to leave you with. 3 different times, these kings are involved and tell them to start, stop, start, stop. Pharaoh tells them, you can go, you can't go, you go, you can't go. And then God says, hey, my people are free. Pharaoh lets them go. This king says they can rebuild, they have to stop, they have to start, and then they get to start again. But more importantly, the prophet said, hey, God told you to do something, don't ever stop doing it. And so they're faithful. The king comes in and says, yeah, I'm going to bless it. He accelerates what they're doing. And as a result of that, they got to celebrate Passover. So they land in this promised land, and they land in this freedom that they have been celebrating for generations and generations to say that we are God's people, and he delivered us from the Egyptians. He's now delivered us again, and we're going to rebuild what he asked us to rebuild. And so you'll see a little bit further on as Gary hops in it, this repetitive story of I'm going to rebuild, I'm going to have some opposition, but I'm going to rebuild. And God keeps using his people and his prophets to say, hey, like, stay with me. I'm steadfast. I got you. I'm going ahead of you. Just stay with me. And so he keeps pulling them along, and he keeps pulling them along. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? Is the fact that we have to be able to endure and remind ourselves that it's his steadfast love that endures. And that pulls us along and draws us with him versus trying to get busy with day to day and forgetting who he actually is. All right, that's 9:51. So there was some more stuff. I'll talk to Gary about how we kind of close that out, give him the cliff notes. But that is the first 6 chapters of Ezra. Thanks, guys.